Gittin Daf begins with a discussion of flower pots. Number of halachas about flower pots, how you're kind of flower pots, how you're kind of the plants growing in a flower pot. What happens if the flower pot's in one eret and the branches are on a different land? And the Gemara will discuss those halachas. Then the Gemara refers back to the Mishnah, which discuss different types of cloth and how they're finished. The Gemara will explain what different types of cloths are, how they're defined, and how their halachas are different. Then the Gemara will get to the Chachamim in the Mishnah, who hold that forgeable cloth is fine for a get, and the Gemara will explain how they hold. Towards the end of the daf, we'll get to our next Mishnah. Let's begin the Gemara. The Gemara is discussing making a kinyan on flower pots. Now, the halacha of kinyanim is as follows. Something which is a movable object is supposed to be acquired with mashicha, that is, pulling the object towards you. If it is a non-movable object like land, then you can't do kinyan mashicha. Obviously, there are three kinyanim that work: kesef, shtar, chazaka. We're talking here where there was no money exchanged, so the kesef has no effect. There is shtar, but we're also discussing here where there's no shtar. So chazaka is the only thing you could do, and the Gemara in other Masechtas describes how chazaka works. Now, in the flower pot itself is considered metaltal. You just pick up the flower pot and move it. Now, the seeds growing in the flower pot and the plants in the pot, interestingly enough, are considered to be karka. They're considered to be unmovable land, even though they're movable. Because if you pick up the flower pot, you're also walking off with what's growing in the flower pot. But it's connected to the ground. We're talking about where there's a hole in the flower pot, so it's considered to be part of the ground. And you're ripping it out of the ground if you steal the flower pot or if you move it. So it's considered to be mechubar lekarka. It's considered to be unmovable real estate. Now, says the Gemara, what happens if you have a flower pot and seeds, plants growing in it, and the plants belong to one person, and the flower pot belongs to another person, and one wants to sell his piece to the other. So if the owner of the flower pot wants to transfer possession of the flower pot to the one who owns the seeds, so you just do mashicha, you just pull the flower pot towards you. Like we said, the flower pot's metaltalin, you clean it with mashicha. If, however, the owner of the seeds wants to sell the seeds to the one who owns the flower pot, so here you can't just pull it, you have to do a chazaka. And we're talking about there's no money, but mashicha doesn't work on it because it's karka. Now, what if both seeds and flower pot are owned by one person and he wants to transfer possession to another person? So if the guy picks up the flower pot and tries to do a chazaka on the flower pot, it doesn't work. If he did a mashicha, it works. But if he just tries to do chazaka on the flower pot, it doesn't work. If he does chazaka on the seeds, that's a proper kinyan, and then he could be kind of the flower pot along with the seeds, and this is what's called nechasim she'eino mechayis are nichnas with nechasim she'esh mechayis. You can make a kinyan on real estate and have that kinyan work for movable property at the same time. So those are two valid ways to make the kinyan. Okay, next talking about flower pots is if you have a split. So you have a flower pot with a hole in it, and the hole is in Eretz Yisrael, but the branches that are growing out of it are outside Eretz Yisrael. They're branching over the border, and they're in Chutzlar. So do you follow the hole? Do you follow the roots? Or do you follow the branches? So Abaye says you follow the hole, and Rava says it goes by the branches. So it says the Gemara, we're talking about where there are no roots that pass through the hole in the flower pot into the ground. If there are roots, everybody would agree, the Gemara claims, at least at first, everybody would agree that you would follow the roots because it's considered to be planted in the ground. If there are no roots, that's where you have a question. Do you go by the hole, which is where the nutrition draws to the ground, or do you go by the branches as to where they are? So the Gemara has two potential proofs that even in a case where you have roots, there's still a machlokes, and there's still an opinion that says that you go by the branches and not by the roots. So the Gemara brings two proofs. The Gemara's first proof is from the Mishnah that discusses two gardens that are near each other, and they are at different heights. They're like on a plateau, or they're in a stepped mountain, and one is a lower step than the other. So there's a vertical wall from the lower garden leading up to the upper garden. Now, the discussion here is what happens if you have a plant growing out of the side wall. Out of the vertical wall it's growing. So it's growing out of the soil of the top garden, and it's growing completely in the airspace of the lower garden. So who does it belong to? So Rameir says it belongs to the upper garden, Rabbi Yehuda says it belongs to the lower garden. So you see here, the roots are clearly by the upper garden, and yet there's still a machlokes whether it belongs to the place where the roots are or the place where the branches are. So Rameir says, no, that's a different reason. The reasoning there has nothing to do with the reasoning here. The reasoning there is because each one could destroy the plant by staying totally within his rights. And that's why there's a machlokas, which one do we say has the right to destroy it and therefore claim possession of it? Rabbi Meir says the upper person could say, I'll take away all my dirt, I'll dig out all my land, lower it, and then the whole middle plant will be destroyed, therefore it's at my mercy and therefore I own it. Rabbi Yehuda says that the person who owns the lower garden can say, I'll fill up all the land, and I'll totally fill in the space with soil, and then I'll destroy the plant in that way. And therefore it's at my mercy and I have control over it. But it's not about where the roots are and where the branches are. If you have a simple flat land and the roots in one place and the branches hanging over somewhere else, there will be no machlokes that you would follow where the roots are. So the Gemara brings another proof, and this is a discussion of a tree which is partially in Eretz Yisrael and partially in Chutz La'aretz. So what do you do about the halacha? Do the fruits growing on this tree require truma and meiser or not? Is it tevel or is it chulin? Now, Rebbe holds that it's both, because you have nutrition from both Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz mixed together. Therefore, each fruit is a mixture. Now, it's a very big nafkamina halacha l'maisa, because then you can't take truma from these fruits on real fruits that are 100% chayiv, because this is partially not chayiv. So you can't pater a real chayiv. You also can't take truma from chulin on this, because chulin is not chayiv and part of this is. So you got to take from this tree only on itself, because it's all mixed together. That's Rebbe's approach. Shimon ben Gamliel says no, the part which is in Eretz Yisrael is chayiv, the part which is in Chutz La'aretz is not chayiv. So now the Gemara says, what are these two parts? How do you have these two? How do you have part Chutz La'aretz and part not? Obviously, it has to be that you have branches on one side of the border, branches on the other side of the border. So you see, the whole discussion is that Rav Shimon ben Gamliel holds you follow the branches, and Rebbe is saying that you follow the roots, and the roots mix together. So Gemara says, no, Rav Shimon ben Gamliel is also following the roots. You have roots on one side, roots on the other side. You have to have a separation of some sort, so there's a rock growing between the two halves of the roots. They're separated from each other. And machlokes is as follows. Rebbe says, even though the roots and the trunk is separated, since the trunk comes together above the rock, the nutrition mixes together and the fruits themselves are nourished from a mixture of Eretz Yisrael and non-Eretz Yisrael soil. Rav Shimon ben Gamliel says no, since it's separate at the base, it remains separate all the way through, and whatever grows on the Eretz Yisrael side is chayiv in truma, whatever grows on the Chutz La'aretz side is not chayiv in truma. And where now refers back to the Mishnah where we had seen mention of the different types of processing of parchment. The Gemara is going to discuss there are 3 levels of processing, and each one has a different function. Because it has a different function, it has a different halacha as far as to how much of it you need to carry on Shabbos to violate the Isser. The halacha of carrying on Shabbos is that it's only if you carried a minimum amount that's functional that there's an Isser, and the different levels of parchment are useful for different things. So there are 3 steps in the parchment finishing process. There's rubbing it with salt, rubbing it with flour, and coating it with a layer of gol juice, which is called afitz. So the first type of processing is called matzah, and it's called matzah because it's pretty much raw. Nothing happens to it. There is no salting, no flouring, or afitz, and it's not useful for anything that needs writing. The only thing that it could be used for is to wrap something, to wrap a small weight, or to wrap a small amount of something. And therefore, its size for carrying on Shabbos is the minimum you need to wrap. How much is that? Abai says it's 1/4 of a quarter in Pumbedisian sizes. The next type of cloth is called chifa. That is salted, but it's neither flour nor afitz. That you can use to write a kameya. Can't use it to write anything that has halachic significance, but you could write a kameya on it if you need to, and therefore the size for Hilchos Shabbos, the violate the issur of carrying, is enough to write a kameya. Now, the next is if you did the salting and the flouring, which you didn't do afitz, that's kosher to write a get on, and that is what's called diftera, that was mentioned in the Mishnah. It is not kosher to write tefillin or anything like that, and therefore you can't use it for that. The size doesn't go by that, it goes by the size to write the get. The Gemara now discusses the halacha we saw in the Mishnah that a forgeable star, a star which you could erase parts of it and not be able to tell, the Chachamim still hold that that's kosher. He said it's possible, but the Chachamim say it's kosher. So Gemara wants to know, how could it be kosher if it's forgeable? So the Gemara answers it's Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar is of the opinion that Edim Mesira Karti. That means the only thing that validates a get is the witnesses who saw it being given. You cannot use a get. You cannot get remarried without having Edim Mesira testifying that they saw it. And they also have to read it. So they will know if something changed. They'll know if there was a condition on it or if there was some detail that was changed or forged. And therefore it doesn't really matter if it's forgeable because you still have to have the Edim Mesira. Now, the Gemara has two machlokes in Amirayim. What is Pshat in Rabbi Elazar? What does he hold? And the machlokes is between the Amir Rabbi Elazar, not the Tana Rabbi Elazar, who we've been discussing, not the Amir Rabbi Elazar, and the Amir Rabbi Yochanan. First machlokes is, what if the get cannot be used until a few days after it was written? Like, let's say it was written and it says that it's only going to be chal 10 days from now. So you can bring the Edim Mesira 10 days from now. So says Rabbi Elazar, even Rabbi Elazar, the Tana, would not be machshir that because we're afraid that the Edim Mesira will forget about some other conditions that were there and were erased. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, you're not afraid they're going to forget, they'll remember. Second machlokes is, what about other shtaris? Would Rabbi Elazar be machshir this in other shtaris as well? The difference is that a get, you write it and you use it right away. However, other shtaris, like a shtar that documents and proves that there was a loan, has to last until the time of the collection of the loan. So the witnesses have to be there and have to remember all those details at collection time. So again, Rabbi Elazar says Rabbi Elazar, the Tana, would not allow it. And he brings the pasuk, it says, V'nechtam b'kli cheres l'maniyam d'yomim rabim. A shtar has to last a long time and be functional. And Rabbi Yochanan says, no, it's fine, because they're not going to forget. It says Yomim Rabim, so okay, that's good advice, but it's not puzzle if you don't follow it. Now begin the next Mishnah. The Mishnah discusses who can write the get. So the Mishnah says two halachas. First of all, anyone can write it, even a cheresh v'katan, that is a deaf, mute, a non-functional person, and a child. All these people are considered to be without proper understanding. Still, they can write the get. The Gemara will explain how. And the second halacha is that a woman can write the get, even though it has to be written by the husband, because it says v'chasav. She could write the get and then be makna it to the husband, give it to the husband, and then he can use it to divorce her, because at least it's his at the time. Now, the man also needs to get something from her. He needs to get a receipt. When he pays the ksuba, he needs to get a receipt. So he could write that and give it to her, and then she gives him that receipt. Now, the reason that she's allowed to write the get is because the main part of the get is the signatures, and therefore, as long as it's signed properly, it doesn't matter who wrote it. Of course, it has to be his possession. Okay, now the Gemara discusses how can a child, a cheresh, or a shota be okay to write it. So the Gemara says, yeah, you have to have an adult observing and supervising what they're doing, making sure that they're doing it the right way. The Gemara has more questions on this, but that'll be on the next stop.